Don't touch the ark. That's one big takeaway from this week's Haftorah that you heard TJ chant so beautifully. You know, TJ started learning that just a few weeks ago, so that was pretty impressive work, and thank God for both the Ashkenazi but also the Sephardi version, and for Miriam. I say thank God for Miriam every day, but Miriam was also helpful, I know, with you and your preparations. So don't touch the ark. I know we're all excited about the new Indiana Jones movie, which can't possibly be worse than the last Indiana Jones movie. But if there's anything we learned from the first installment, which was really quite good, it's that the ark will mess you up if you're not careful or not worthy. But the question I want to ask today isn't whether Uzzah deserved his fate. I think it's safe to say that the text portrays him as a bit of a schlemiel. He wasn't trying to overstep. There was no malice in his action, quite the opposite. No, the question I want to consider is what kind of harm can be caused with the best of intentions? How can an act meant to protect actually destroy? What happens when we don't think deeply and carefully about our behavior? Today, I want to explore the danger of overcorrection. So let's review the story. The Philistines, David's arch-nemesis, move into Emek Rephaim, the valley of Rephaim. Now, you may know Emek Rephaim from today's German colony, its progressive Jerusalem synagogues and a few darn good artisanal coffee joints. But back then, it was just a valley stretching from the southwest towards the southern limits of Jerusalem. David, only recently made King David HaMelech, has just captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites and made it into his capital. But the Philistines are a stubborn enemy. So with God's blessing, David confronts them, drawing them out toward Baal Pratzim. But though David defeats them, it's a Pyrrhic victory. The Philistines, they regroup again in Emek Rephaim, perhaps because the coffee is so good, and David is forced to do battle with them again. This time, David circles around and routs them. The verse, as chapter 5 of 2 Samuel comes to a close, says, Vayach et plishtim migava ad boacha gazer. And he rooted the Philistines from Geva all the way to Gezer. So you with me? Okay. So now the Philistines have been pushed out of the area, and King David is able to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, which will, going forward, be its home base. But while they're doing so, something terrible happens. They load the Aron Habrit onto an ox cart at the home of someone named Avinadav. Avinadav's two sons are responsible for guiding the transport. As the ark is rolling along, David and the entire house of Israel are dancing. There's a marching band with all manner of instruments. Everyone is having a blast, and amidst the cacophonous revelry, the oxen slip. Now pay attention, because the text here is incredibly layered. The place where this happens is Goren Nachon, the threshing floor of Nachon, which means correct. Not overcorrect, but correct. Avinadav's son, Uzzah, who reaches out to grasp the ark and prevent its falling. His name means strength, from the word Oz, as in Adonai Oz li'amo yiten. God gives strength to the people. So we're at the right place and the right time with the right guy, this big, strong guy, to prevent catastrophes. The oxen slip. Uzzah reaches out to catch the ark, and everything goes sideways. God is incensed. Vayichar af Hashem be'Uzzah, and Uzzah is struck down, dying instantly right there next to the ark. Why does this happen? It's not entirely clear. Rashi says it was because he made a mistake. The Hebrew of the Rashi is shkaga, which means an unintentional error. And what were the results of this horrific blunder? David, moments ago, dancing before the Lord, is utterly shaken. The text uses the word vayichar and vayirah. He was mad and he was terrified. He's so scared, in fact, that he aborts the plan to bring the ark into the city and stashes it somewhere else for 3 months. Unintended consequences. What would have happened if David wasn't so spooked, if Uzzah had restrained himself, if God had let him off with a warning? This story feels steeped in overcorrections. But of course, the danger of overcorrection is not just a biblical thing. We have plenty of it these days, don't we? And I can't think of a forum where it's more present or more malevolent than the Supreme Court. This Tuesday, the court will hear a case that, on the face of it, sounds pretty good for observant Jews, pretty good for religious freedom. But don't be fooled. It's an overcorrection of biblical proportions, and the consequences for Jews in this country, for other religious minorities, could be as harmful as Uzzah grasping the live wire that was the Holy Ark. The case is Groff versus DeJoy. Remember DeJoy? He's still around. But before we get to that case, we need to go back to 1977 to a landmark religious liberty case called Transworld Airlines versus Hardison. Larry Hardison was a TWA employee who was also a member of a church whose tenets included abstaining from work on the biblical Sabbath. He was eventually fired for refusing to work on Saturdays, and in a 7-2 ruling, the Supreme Court held that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not protect employees if an employer suffers, quote-unquote, undue hardship, and accommodating Hardison would have cost only $150 over 3 months for TWA, but the court held in that case that undue hardship, that is the language of the Civil Rights Act, equals more than a de minimis cost, which is Latin for basically bubkas. Justices Thurgood Marshall and William Brennan said the following in Marshall's very powerful dissent. One of the most intractable problems arising under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has been whether an employer is guilty of religious discrimination when he discharges an employee or refuses to hire a job applicant because of the employee's religious practices. Particularly troublesome has been the plight of adherents to minority faiths who do not observe the holy days on which most businesses are closed, Sundays, Christmas, and Easter, but who need time off their own days of religious observance. And here's where Marshall's clarion call for religious minority protections ought to be ringing in our ears nearly 50 years later. An employer, the court concludes, need not grant even the most minor special privileges, he writes, to religious observers to enable them to follow their faith. As a question of social policy, this result is deeply troubling for a society that truly values religious pluralism, cannot compel adherents of minority religions to make the cruel choice of surrendering their religion or their job. I must say personally, as someone who's sending 2 kids to public school, as someone who's counseled congregants and conversion candidates over the years who were forced to make impossible choices between work's demands and God's, Hardison has been harmful, no doubt. And I wish to high heaven that some prior iteration of SCOTUS had corrected the real damage caused by that ruling. But here's the problem. The 1977 court, which was overly dismissive of religious pluralism, was no more or less concerned about minority rights than the court today. In fact, the Roberts Court, the Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Barrett, and Kavanaugh Court can hardly be trusted to protect Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, and other non-Christians. Look at Kennedy v. Bremerton last year, or Carson v. Macon. Do we really think that this court shares Marshall and Brennan's vision of religious tolerance? No. This court has been laser-focused since winning the conservative Christian supermajority on eroding the wall of separation between religion and state, by reinforcing claims of religious expression by Christians against non-religious and often otherwise religious Americans. That is to say, the court is much less interested in protecting all Americans from the government's establishment of religion and much more interested in protecting the religious liberties of America's religious majority. In 1977, the Supreme Court overcorrected in favor of employers and their financial concerns over employees and their spiritual needs. Today, the court stands ready to overturn Hardison with a 1-2 punch that could lay waste to all kinds of protections afforded to religious minorities. Chavra, make no mistake, this is a pretty bracing moment of potential overcorrection. The first punch is Groff v. DeJoy. The titular character in that case is Gerald Groff, who is a religious Christian and whose observance of Sunday Sabbath precludes his being able to work on those days. Blame Amazon, I guess, because USPS, which used to avoid Sunday deliveries, entered into a contract for package deliveries. And Groff had to resign his post rather than violate his Christian religious principles. Again, on the face of it, this is deeply unfortunate. Why should Gerald Groff have to, as Justice Marshall said, make the cruel choice of surrendering his religion or his job? So a better solution is needed for the Gerald Groffs of the world, just as a better solution is needed for the so many religious people of varying traditions whose faith and observance have frequently bumped up against a less than tolerant United States. But here's the thing. The law firm representing Mr. Groff is called First Liberty Institute, a Christian conservative organization that brought us, you guessed it, school prayer case Kennedy v. Bremerton, and school voucher case Carson v. Macon. Their other major case making its way through the courts right now is also a Title VII case. It's called Strader v. CVS. And in it, First Liberty represents J. Robin Strader, a CVS employee who wishes to be exempt from prescribing contraception under Title VII because of her religious objection to birth control. Right now, the rights of those seeking legal contraception are protected under the court's interpretation of Title VII. But what happens if Groff prevails and Hardison is no longer in force? What happens when one pharmacist, maybe the only pharmacist at some small town's local pharmacy, has religious objections to certain medications, or maybe to serving certain customers, like LGBTQ people, or Muslims, or Jews? For many hundreds of years, Christian hegemonies kept our people in their place, as it were, or as we know, much worse, as we are very close to the observance of Yom HaShoah. And they did this for the imagined sins of our ancestors. Aren't those religious beliefs? Okay, perhaps I'm overstating it a little. I don't want to be overly alarmist, but I do believe that there's reason to be deeply concerned here. Where do the rights of minorities end when bigots in the majority have such powerful allies? You may have seen that Justice Alito restored full access to mifepristone yesterday, but not indefinitely. There will be an additional briefing on Wednesday, the day after the Supreme Court hears Groff. That's right, the FDA will have to make its case that it knows more than 9 lawyers in robes about which medications are safe. Do you hear what I'm saying about the danger of overcorrection? When Uzzah grabbed the ark, surely he had the best of intentions. He didn't think that his chivalrous behavior would bring about more harm than good. On first glance, the Groff case seems like a good idea. In 1977, the 7-2 majority probably thought that it was forestalling more problems than it was creating. But what if Uzzah had been more prepared? What if instead of acting rashly, he had been more strategic? What if he had considered not just his desire to protect the ark, but what the ark really stood for? Rashi speaks of Uzzah's mistake. What exactly was the mistake? According to the 11th century commentator, it was that he didn't allow his reasoning to take him to the next level. Surely, he must have known of the ark's capabilities, of its history. Think back to the moment that the Aron entered the land of Israel, says Rashi. What's written in the book of Joshua? HaKohanim nosei Aron omdim betoch hayarden. The priests who bore the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan until all the instructions that Hashem had ordered Joshua to convey to the people had been carried out. And so the people speedily crossed over. And when all the people finished crossing, the ark of the Lord crossed, and the priests went before the people. If this is a little confusing, you're in good company. But Rashi says, just look ahead a few verses. Look to verse 18, where it says, Nitku kapot raglei kohanim. The soles of the feet of the kohanim were lifted. And he explains, they were lifted from the water to the dry land next to them, and the water returned to its place. The result, he says, is that the ark was on the eastern side, and the children of Israel were on this, that is, the western side of the river. Thus, the ark lifted its carriers and crossed over. It was regarding this that Uzzah was punished when he took hold of the ark. For if the ark carried its carriers, it certainly was able to carry itself. The priests didn't lift the ark lifted the priests. And Uzzah, poor Shlemiel, tried to save the day and forgot what he was dealing with. This is the danger of overcorrecting. We make it about the here and now. The most obvious and pressing concerns of the moment, and we forget the larger context, that rather than swinging madly from one extreme to the next, we might do better to choose a more measured path. Uzzah's real sin was that while striving to restore balance to the ark, he disrupted balance in the universe. The universe of jurisprudence, indeed of governance, is unbalanced in this country right now. And those of us who care about its future, we'd better pay attention. And those of us who call ourselves religious had better be prepared to fight for better outcomes. We must stop overcorrecting. We must stop falling into the trap of accepting one dogma to avoid the dangers of another. The First Amendment of the Constitution lays out two fundamental protections: the right of each person to believe and practice as they see fit, and the necessity of the state to avoid imposing any particular belief or practice on its citizens. The seesaw of establishment versus free expression is toxic. We must do both. We must restore balance. The only correct path forward is to stop overcorrecting. Shabbat Shalom.